Well, there's big breaking news in the newspaper the president loves to hate tonight, perhaps not so much tonight. The Washington Post's Carol Leonnig and Robert Costa reporting that Special Counsel Mueller has briefed the president's legal team and told them he does not, and I repeat, not consider him a criminal target at this point. Leonnig and Costa are attributing it to three people familiar with the discussions. They report that in talks early last month about a possible presidential interview, Mr. Mueller described the president as a subject of the probe. The question is, what's the distinction? Joining us for that is CNN Chief Legal Analyst Jeffrey Toobin and CNN Legal Analyst Carrie Cordero. So, Jeff, this news that Mueller is continuing to investigate President Trump but does not consider him a criminal target, but rather a subject of his investigation. What is the difference?
Well, in federal law enforcement, there are three categories of witnesses. There are targets who are almost certainly going to be charged, going to be indicted. There are witnesses who are just people whose information is of value to the prosecutors. And in between the two, there is something called a subject. That is someone who is under investigation, but who may or may not be charged. Trump is a subject, and I think that's particularly good news for him. I mean, it's a big deal to be under criminal investigation by the FBI, particularly if you're president of the United States. This has been implicit in what the Mueller investigation has been doing, but this confirmation that the president is under criminal investigation, I mean, that's a pretty profound thing to think about.
And Carrie, according to the Washington Post reporting, to the point that Jeff just made, some of the president's attorneys have told him that's part of the danger of him sitting down for an interview, that you can go from being a subject to actually a target pretty quickly.
Well, one could, depending on the outcome of that interview. So certainly, being a subject, they shouldn't be cracking open any champagne in the White House if he's the subject of an investigation, as Jeffrey just described. There is certainly risk of him sitting down for an interview, although it's really difficult at this point to see a path forward for this investigation, both in terms of its look at the Russian influence on the election and any potential cooperation or knowledge on behalf of the campaign, and the obstruction piece. It's hard to see how it will conclude without the president at some point being interviewed by the investigative team.
Well, but in a normal circumstance, a subject would simply take the fifth, would simply say, I mean, most lawyers would advise a subject of an investigation, don't talk under any circumstances. Now, the question, of course, is, can the president of the United States take the fifth? I think he can. I think he can just announce the investigation and say, this is a witch hunt, I'm not participating. I don't know what the political fallout of that is, but I think it's entirely possible he just will simply refuse this interview.
Carrie, I mean, according to the reporting, Mueller is still pushing hard, obviously, to interview President Trump to both determine if the president had any corrupt intent, and that's why he feels this interview is so important, that he needs to figure out the intent behind some of Mr. Trump's actions.
Certainly, and on the obstruction piece in particular, the intent that he personally had is really important to that investigation because, of course, it's actions that he took, statements that he made over the course of approximately a year that potentially could put together the case for obstruction. So on that piece in particular, he probably has the most exposure, but also his statements or what he has to say about his intent is also the most relevant to that piece of the investigation.
Jeff, I heard you earlier today talking, there was news on other fronts as well in terms of the investigation. I heard you talking about some of the developments today led you to think it very possible that Paul Manafort might try to get a plea agreement.
Well, I thought that for a long time. I mean, he is in desperate legal trouble. Now that his right-hand man, Gates, has pleaded guilty and will cooperate against him, I just think his case is nearly indefensible. It will take millions of dollars to prepare because it's a very complicated case. And also, he's nearly 70 years old. He's looking at a sentence that could leave him in prison for the rest of his life if he goes to trial. There's a motion pending in front of the judge where the judge is being asked by Manafort's lawyers, throw the case out because Mueller doesn't have the jurisdiction to bring it. Mueller's brief, which just came in yesterday, makes a very convincing case that he does have jurisdiction, and I just think the walls are closing in on Manafort, where he's really in an untenable legal position.
And Kerry, I mean, Mueller is required to report his conclusions to the Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein, and to Jeff's point, in the brief that Mueller filed last night, it basically said that he has been checking in with Rosenstein all the way, at every step of this.
He has. It's very clear from that filing. I mean, Rosenstein has been clear in his public statements and his testimony before Congress that he has been conducting active oversight of the special counsel's investigation. So that the memo that was filed as an attachment to the government's pleading last night confirms that oversight that he's been conducting. But on the issue of a report, this is really a question that myself and other observers of this case have really been trying to figure out, is what type of report might get filed. The regulations don't require what we might think of as a Whitewater style report, or what normally we might see in a congressional type investigation of a big narrative explanatory document that is meant for public consumption. There's nothing in the regulations that require that. What might happen is that the investigative team, they could write a report, or they could write prosecutive memos and submit those to Rod Rosenstein in his acting attorney general capacity. And then it's up to him whether or not to make those reports in whatever format they take place, whether or not they make them public.
Kerry